sort of the eastern part of Ukraine is the one most affected by the blackouts. This is where Russia is hitting most at the power facilities. What is dangerous is that not only the power lines and the usual power stations are being hit, but actually during the last missile hit, again going back to the 23rd of November, where 70 missiles were launched in one single 24 hours across the whole of Ukraine. 30 power stations were hit, 14 generation facilities were damaged, and this is the first time when all of the 15 nuclear reactors were cut off from power at the same time. And this is a historic anti-record when we're speaking in global terms. This has never happened when even the nuclear reactors had to be cut off. So this essentially could lead to a nuclear catastrophe. And this is why we Ukrainians, since the first day, have been so eager and calling for closure of our skies and enhancement of our air defense systems, and providing us with the military capacity to do that, because our humanitarian aid today is actually the weapons which we get. This is the best humanitarian aid that we can have.
Have the aid organizations responded with alternative systems? I mean, if a building, you describe buildings where the pipes freeze and the building is essentially not usable for until the spring. In those cases, do people just vacate that building, or do they have alternative heating systems? Do they set fires? What do the aid organizations do to help, either with heating or with communications?
At the moment, this is a risk which could become very much acute risk and very much happening, but this has not happened yet. Buildings had not had to be vacated. We have managed to maintain the electricity and power supplies and to get the power going at least for 2-3 hours, which is just enough for the water not to freeze in the radiators. But we are assessing the risks, and this is one of them, which can become imminent. As for the heating inside the houses, inside the homes, people have started buying up generators, power generators. For not all of the homes can have power generators installed, and actually this is leading to a new kind of problem because of the lack of knowledge of how to use these power generators. Some people find themselves installing gas burners, power generators inside the apartments, and we already had some tragedies and casualties of this equipment exploding because it is not meant to be used inside facilities. So this is another problem we are coming in, and this is another strain on our state emergency services.
You mentioned 1.4 million Ukrainians don't have access to water. Did you mean water for washing, water for drinking? You don't live very long without water. What do they do?
It's water for drinking. Because you have to understand, 14 million Ukrainians have been forced to leave their homes. So we're talking about 14 million displaced persons. The majority, the half of them are displaced within Ukraine. It's internally displaced persons, IDP, a term we have become very much accustomed to in Ukraine since 2014, when Russia's aggression first started. And around 7 million, maybe a little over, have been forced to flee abroad. Again, whether they come back, whether they register in Ukraine or abroad, not all of them register. This is the numbers which we estimate from different sources. But these people in their usual homes, in their usual abodes, they would not have access to clean and safe drinking water for use of for household needs and so on.
One more question. I know the war is still raging, but people are already talking about the cost of reconstruction and who is going to pay for it. I know that our National Audit Office here is doing work with your audit institution on trying to get a number, some rough, accurate estimate of the cost of reconstruction. Are you aware of how that's proceeding, what the likely total cost is going to be, and who's going to pay for it?
Our Ministry of Justice is working on the preparation of a consolidated claim to Russia, which would include whole lists of damages and harm done to Ukraine, and putting these lists in monetary and financial equivalent. So this is damage done to the environment, to energy, to business, to residential housing, moral damages, with this consolidated claim to be presented to Russia, because it is Russia and Russia alone who has caused all the damage, all the suffering, all the pain, all the harm to Ukraine, and it is Russia and Russia alone who should pay. It's not up to the British taxpayers, the French taxpayers, or anyone else. This must be very clear, and we in Ukraine are absolutely crystal clear about that. Reparations must and are an imminent part of the guarantee of non-repetition of the crime of aggression. And this is what we are working towards, our government on its level, us as parliamentarians on our own level. At the moment, the estimates range over $1 trillion of reparations that would need to be paid to Ukraine. Where does this money come from? Well, technically from Russia. How do we make Russia pay? That's a discussion which I would like to ask you to open in Parliament with the British society and with the within international platforms where you represent your country and where you hold dialogue with international partners. But for the short term being, there is some $350 billion in Russian money and assets in state and national banks all across the world, which can be not just arrested, but which must be seized to serve Ukraine's defense needs and possibly to serve short-term restoration, rebuilding needs again in Ukraine. It shouldn't be British taxpayers. There's Russian money readily available in the UK. We estimate that some $16 to $18 billion in pound equivalent are located in the Bank of England. This money can well be used already for short-term rebuilding needs and for defense needs of Ukraine. And this is where, honourable members, I ask you to put in request to the Bank of England to find out the exact amounts of Russian reserve money and assets that are being held there, and to also initiate, if possible, the seizure of this money and these assets to be used to help Ukraine.
Thank you. The sanctions that the UK government has put in place, I think, are on individuals. Do we have any on Russia as a state?
Sanctions on Russia as a state, am I correct to understand?
Yes.
I understand that the UK has been actually moving for sanctions on Russia as a state even back when you were members of the EU, and that you are still being the champions behind imposing sanctions on Russia as a state. This means Russian businesses which are operating in the UK, which used to operate in the UK on Russian state business and partnerships and contracts which were made between UK and Russia. So all of this, my understanding is that it operates. Again, how well it operates, it's probably my question to you.
It'll be a question that we will be following up after this session. Thank you very much. Virendra.
Thank you. Hi. You mentioned briefly or touched the cold weather. I'm sure that some of us are not very familiar with the Ukraine winter, how it looked like. But you tell us how it looked like, the winter, but at the same time, is the international community has provided enough support to meet that challenge if it is too cold or?
The international community, I can respond to what the governments have provided. I think that in terms of charities, we have speakers here who can provide more information. In terms of government provisions, the needs are covering the most acutely affected areas, which is down through the front line, east of Ukraine, southeast, northeast of Ukraine. This is where we are told most of what is being provided by foreign government goes. The needs are not just in generators, although this is the word which you all hear most on the news and everywhere, but it's also in a whole range of specific equipment, specific parts which are needed to mend defend and amend the destroyed and the damaged power and energy infrastructure. We're talking about auto transformers, current transformers, circuit breakers, earthing switches, and there's a whole list which we can provide you with, which would include what has already been supplied to Ukraine and the need. And also we have the need by country. So it's not just things that can be produced, manufactured, and donated or delivered to Ukraine, but it is also the things that can be produced and manufactured in other countries. And this is where we would ask you honourable colleagues to have these dialogues and conversations on behalf of Ukraine with Germany, France, and a whole lot of other countries who could be doing more, who are doing already a lot but could be doing more.
How, you want to add something?
Yeah, I would like to add a little bit about winter, right? Yeah. So our humanitarian community has been preparing for winter long before events started in summer. And I guess the whole preparation was sufficient. It could be better coordinated. But I guess the understanding of the conditions, and winter can be quite different in Ukraine, and due to climate change, it could be rather warm sometimes, but this year, unfortunately, it's not the case. And the east of Ukraine, especially Kharkiv, Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, have the most harsh winter condition, and temperatures deep low below, like sometimes minus 20. It may be snowing and freezing, and sleet can be everywhere, so it's rather wet. Generally speaking, humanitarian community supports collective centers where people can come and get warmer, can charge their phones, can drink tea or eat something just temporarily until the situation restores. But for the non-government controlled areas and areas near the contact line, the situation is completely different. And this is something the UK government could do to expedite negotiations on access to the non-government controlled areas, engage maybe parties that are accepted as neutral in these negotiations, because we're trying through partners to deliver some heaters, blankets, warm clothes and winter kits to populations in non-government controlled areas, but definitely it's not the case because the level of disruption, especially on the line of active hostilities, is immense. And OCHA and UN has some safety assurances, some of them. Of course, all international and local organizations have very severe restrictions to access these areas. But if the government of the UK could somehow support these negotiations and support the sanctions regime for humanitarian actors, because right now everybody working with de facto authorities on the ground can face criminal liability for doing that. So for us, it is critical to have humanitarian exemptions so that we could deliver winter items and support communities.
And as to the medical equipment, of course, generators, UPS systems, all kinds of power stations, solar power stations are absolutely critical to maintain and sustain the work of hospitals and medical care institutions, and also particular medical items such as blood and fluid warming systems, irrigation system, that warm fluid as it's being delivered to the patient, bear huggers, ready heat blankets that are necessary particularly for the winter period. So the range of urgently needed items has grown, and so we need to take that into account.
Thank you very much. Tessia, how are you preparing for a potential acceleration in the conflict in terms of a humanitarian response?
The short answer is as best as we can under the given circumstances. But seriously speaking, the situation is that it can change at any moment, and it can escalate at any moment. We understand that well enough. This is also where our determination to fight as hard as we can and to get rid of Russia's aggression as fast as we can comes from, because until Russia is neutralized as an aggressor power, we will always be living at risk of escalation. And for us in Ukraine, since the 24th of February, we know well enough, come what may, we will be fighting. Our government is preparing different scenario plans for the escalation of attacks on the energy infrastructure. There's different contingency plans in the worst case scenario, what to do up to evacuation from urban areas, although we hope that this scenario never comes, because we know well enough that this is part of Russia's strategy to possibly vacate the cities so that the cities are easier to take by force. We are keen on not having that happen. This is why there's constant negotiations of different government ministers in different sectors with different countries as to all the forms of heating devices and heating equipment, like the experts here have mentioned in the medical sphere and the humanitarian sphere, like I said, and on the energy sphere. Really, it's in our interest that while we keep our population safe and sound and working and operational in the cities, our army can continue to progress and proceed on the front lines. We cannot allow for these next few months to be a standstill on the front lines, because this means that the Russian military will dig themselves in, and it will be virtually impossible to dig them out come March, come spring, when the conditions are more favorable to the counteroffensives. So we are interested in having moves going there. But really, the situation is that we are summoning every single resource that is possible within the country and also beyond. And here it's again crucial to have assistance not just from our usual suspects in terms of assistance and allies in the Northern Hemisphere, but also to get the Global South involved, to get the Arab countries involved, to get them contributing with the resources, because the kind of aggressor Ukraine is fighting is the kind of aggressor Europe and the world has not seen since World War II.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing, not only here but also abroad. I want to start on asking a few questions on how the the invasion is affecting marginalised groups, especially women and girls and elderly people. Namina, you spoke briefly about the lack of education because of the power cuts, the blackouts, and the mental health effect, that it's having on children. And you also spoke about those who are here and abroad, should we say, and those who are displaced at home in Ukraine. So if you could break it up and talk about the picture so we can get a better understanding of how it is affecting those who are in Ukraine and those who have been able to flee and go abroad.
Absolutely. Well, for Ukrainian children in Ukraine, the situation is way harder because they need to struggle with the ongoing hostilities. They need to live through this violence and go to bunkers and shelters and being all the time in danger of immediate physical harm and being in huge emotional distress daily. So if not addressed in terms of mental health, that can have a very lasting long-term impact, because children growing through this continuous stress, they may develop some certain conditions. And we're doing a lot of work now providing mental and psychosocial support, but this definitely needs more funding and programming inclusively for different age, and because it has gender specific, and we actually have some statistics basically on children abroad we could survey, but anyway that children do girls and boys differently handle with stress. Of course that's individual and it's not gender-based in particular, but boys really do those in refuge and being displaced. They want to come back home more, and older children, they just feel less interested in coming. So that really is gender and age specific. So when we're looking at the whole community of children, we need to specifically understand their intentions and their status. Among all children in Ukraine and abroad, actually, refugee children, the most vulnerable are children from institutions and unaccompanied and separated children, because they are not accounted for right now. Basically, we don't understand how many children cross the border and how, because at the very beginning, early in March, we have some data from anecdotal countries. We know that about 4,000 unaccompanied children entered Italy. About 1,000 entered Spain. So some countries provide statistics. Some countries like Poland, who is the biggest recipient now and host to Ukrainian refugees, they don't have this data. And that's why it's immediate need to ensure case management system and proper registration of children so that we could track their journey, understand where they are. The children in institutions, this is another question. Ukraine used to be, even before February 2022, the country in Europe with the biggest population of children in residential care in institutions. It was more than 100,000, and now these children are specifically vulnerable because some of them cross the border just with their legal guardians, and again, it's very complicated how to track their route and their destiny. Some children who appeared on non-government controlled areas, now we're trying to collect. We don't have mandate for investigate this, but we're actively engaging in communication with accountability sector to identify what is the destiny of children who have been transferred abroad, and how it is possible to understand, because previously children in institutions, about 70% of them had the living parent, so they were just in institutional care because their parents found themselves in hardship and essentially needed some social support, and about half of them, of children, had some level of disability. So that makes these children particularly so much vulnerable, and it is essential to understand where they are, and we're calling again for support from the UK government to ensure additional programming and funding for this. Of course, blackout and access to healthcare. Just last week, I guess all the world has been shocked with the attack on maternity hospital, with just a 2-day-old baby being killed. So all the mothers being pregnant right now, and they face increased risk. And we have the family whom we support in Collective Center in Ukraine, who unfortunately had a premature baby because of stress, because mothers have to face constant stress through their pregnancy, and essentially some of them deliver babies prematurely and they need additional medical care, and in these circumstances hospitals cannot provide this care. So this just faces additional burden on already stretched healthcare system. The energy cut blackouts, they pose really great risk to mobility of elderly people, to parents with children, because especially urban areas in Ukraine are multi-storied buildings, essentially. So without lifts, without electricity, you cannot properly move and access services. And of course, gender-based violence and risk of trafficking, abuse, and exploitation is here. And we understand that women and girls used to be always at more risk of this of abuse, and here now being displaced, and a lot of them internally displaced and forced to share their accommodation with sometimes even strangers or not immediate members. That of course increases social tension and puts women and children in increased risk of abuse, possibly. So we are also urging for multi-sectoral programming for child protection and for mental health, and for to ensure that all children are in safety and they have access to learning. Because about education I mentioned previously, but this is a huge problem, and with the continuous blackouts, it may jeopardize children being already in certain negative dynamics on learning due to COVID pandemics, and some children, especially in primary education, who haven't been even to real school because of 2 years of quarantines. Now they're again forced to bunkers and they can't go normally to school. So yes, these are probably the most acute problems right now. Yeah.
Amina, you spoke briefly about the markets not always being open. When they are open, have you seen a hike in prices for food as well?
Well, in Ukraine, currently, I guess everywhere there is an inflation, and so there is a lot of people lost their jobs, so they lack finances actually, and prices grew up, and I guess that. Generally speaking, private sector in Ukraine and the society is very much mobilized. So as soon as everything opens, it starts immediately operating, and it gives hope to people. But accessing this, that's why we are focusing on cash and voucher assistance in the most marginalized communities and vulnerable communities, so that they could immediately get some help. And then if they need any further assistance, we're registering them for programs and providing help further on.
Can I jump in on that with some numbers? So the inflation at the moment, we expect that by the end of the year it will reach 30%. So this gives you an idea of the rise of prices for basic needs and basic commodities. In terms of the unemployment rate, it stands at 17.5% at the moment, and that's some 2.6 million people who have lost their jobs. This is huge because it also impacts a lot of business, a lot of small and medium business. 47% of the businesses in Ukraine have had to go bankrupt. It's 47%. This is huge. You can imagine the number of the territory that is under occupation. You can imagine the territory where people have had to relocate. You have the numbers of women and who were a large factor of the working force in Ukraine who have left the country, and then you have the number of men and women who have joined the military to serve. So this gives you an idea what happened, especially to the small and medium business. Despite that, it always warms my heart, at least, to see new places opening up in Kyiv, Lviv, and Ternopil, and other cities across Ukraine. So people are still finding ways to go on living life. In terms of the vulnerability numbers, and Armina mentioned the children, another big issue that you must be aware of is the deportation and the targeted deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. This is especially happening when the Russian troops enter Ukrainian territories and establish control there. So far, according to our ombudsman, we have 11,461 deported Ukrainian children illegally held in the territory of Russia. Some of these children have been abducted from their families. Some of these children have been in orphanages, and it's whole facilities, institutions that have been deported to Russia. Now, the numbers that Russia presents us with are much, much higher. Russia is claiming that some 700,000 children have been provided refuge in Russia, and they form part of the 4 million Ukrainian nationals who have been also given refuge, as Russia says it, in their territory, when essentially it's one big lie because people are made to move there. There is the only kind of talks that are going on right now is about freeing these children and returning them home. And in small groups, regularly, there are success stories, success cases when children are being returned home, are being reunited with their families. So this is something to be aware of. This is something to raise probably with international institutions such as the Red Cross, who's supposed to be doing much more than they are doing on this issue, and other UN facilities.
Are the children you're talking about that are being taken from occupied Ukraine being taken to Russia itself?
Some of them largely are, and when they are being taken, they are there's two places where they are taken. So it's either these kind of sanatoriums, which are kind of, I don't know, resort facilities, whatever, and they are being held there essentially like children's camps or institutions, or they are being put up for adoption. Oh. And since May, June this year, Russia has amended its legislation to facilitate the procedure for adopting Ukrainian children, specifically Ukrainian children.
I mean, I'm not an expert on the Geneva Convention, but that sounds a clear breach of the Geneva Convention.
Russia has opened the Geneva Convention like a book, and they used it as a list, and they tick every provision they can break, and I think they have broken every single rule in the rule book.
And the international community needs to stand up.
Absolutely.
In a united way and challenge, and that's a very specific example of that.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Kate, to interrupt.
That's fine, no, that's fine. Back to Nomina. Thank you, Lesia, for what you've just said. In regards to the people who have been displaced abroad, are you able to give us a picture of how the invasion has affected their lives?
The estimate is that more than 7 million refugees entered European states primarily, and we are 70% of them are women and children. So we understand that the scope of the most vulnerable populations entering Europe is huge. We have been talking to children, to more than 1,600 households, actually asking them how they feel. And what I mentioned before, a lot of them feel not happy. Children feel frustration. Half of them couldn't say even that they have a single friend. So mostly children struggle with assimilation, and part of the problem is that they just don't enroll, a lot of them do not enroll in formal education. Before the start of school year in September this year, only one third of refugee children have been enrolled in schools, and after asking if they will continue their studying in September, starting school year, 1/4 said that they don't intend to. So just to break why this is happening, it happens for various reasons. Partly because parents expect, and the expectation of refugee communities is just to come back sooner. So they just think that it's not a protracted crisis and they will come back to their normal living. Sometimes children struggle with foreign language, and it just like jeopardizes their ability to learn new material. And as the Minister of Education of Ukraine advised to enroll in distance learning and continue their distance education, many families prioritize Ukrainian distance learning. But now, starting October and November, it is in danger, and teachers just cannot connect and provide their lessons. So right now, children who prioritize Ukrainian school and haven't enrolled in formal education in public schools in Europe, they end up without any school at all. So that's a problem. Yes, again, in Europe, and the same can be said for Homes for Ukraine scheme in the UK. There is a need for long-term planning and for a longer strategy, how these families will continue their living if they decide to. And if they're free to go, they may go to the country of their choice. But anyways, right now, the most recent data from the Office of Statistics was that half of Homes for Ukraine's residents think they will stay for 3 years and longer. So that might be indicative that some of them will stay, and it will require continuous support and continuous psychosocial, educational support and other types of benefits that might be supportive of the Ukrainian refugee community. But at the same time, we at Save the Children would like to use this best practice because the UK was such an excellent host to so many Ukrainian refugees, just to expand this practice for other vulnerable communities from all over the world, and the refugees from other crises need this support as much as Ukrainian refugees. So if this support could be expanded and this practice used and lessons learned, that would be fantastic to support other people in need elsewhere.
Thank you for what you've just said. I think a lot of people would appreciate that. Lastly, well, actually, I've got another question after this one, but just lastly, to yourself, Lamina, what humanitarian assistance is being provided to support women and girls, and do you think this assistance is actually sufficient?
There is definitely a need for more inclusive programming on gender-based violence prevention, and we're very supportive of the commitment of the UK government to fight with sexual violence and conflict, and commitments yesterday voiced during PSVI conference. Mm-hmm. So again, funding and support and programming to support women facing gender-based violence, conflict-related sexual violence. This is definitely a priority. Support for comprehensive auditing and scenario planning for mental health support for children and women as well. That would be much needed. Employment, displacement, and now employment abroad, that needs action because a lot of families struggle to find job, and if they find job, it's low paid, and they essentially face hardship renting the private accommodations. So this is again echoing this previous conversation about homelessness. So without proper support and from the government, from councils on the ground, families who have been employed and basically started over in the new place, they might need this just additional support to build this network who would be their references and guarantors in future, and for them not to push them to relocate, because we understand that the biggest scope of Ukrainian refugees came to England among all 4 nations, and especially southern England, where the cost of living is very challenging, and that's why here women with children sometimes need to identify if they need to prioritize their employment or find an accommodation. So this kind of support and comprehensive programming and strategy on Ukrainian refugees would be very much appreciated.
Thank you. And Natalia, I wanted to ask you how the war has affected elderly people, and are aid agencies providing enough?
Thank you. I have some statistics. This is the category of a group of people we have been helping before the full-scale invasion. We had our partners in Ukraine who helped us to cover the cost of medical care and treatment for the pensioners and the elderly. However, now it's we have refocused our operation, and unfortunately we cannot dedicate our time. We don't have the human resources to focus on that. But I have some statistics. So the elderly account for 30% of those in need in Ukraine, and that's the highest proportion of elderly people in the world who are in that situation, and half of those who are food insecure. And more specifically, the elderly population in the war zone, 91%, they don't have enough food, and 79% don't have access to drinking water. Many of them are separated from their families. Their sons are either serving in the army or in the territorial defense. The mothers with children have evacuated. So it's a serious tragical situation that they found themselves in. And of course, they don't have access to wider emergency relief efforts. They are not mobile. They are have developed chronic diseases which cannot be looked at, and they just don't have obviously the quality of life.
So what's the message that you'd like to get out to aid agencies to help this very
The
needy
message is to find
demographic?
the routes to access the elderly. And perhaps the best way of doing that is to establish contacts with the local Ukrainian charities, non-profits, who can deliver aid directly. I can give you one example that we did deliver a small aid.
If you could write to us with that one example, that would be lovely. Thank you. We're getting really tight on time. That's
Okay,
all.
it's a very quick example.
Thank you very much. If you could write to us on that.
Okay,
Nigel.
sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask what the situation is like in the neighbouring countries who've taken lots of people in? I mean, I saw Moldova had power cuts because their grid was linked to Ukraine's. I mean, are we expecting a challenging winter for people who've crossed the border as well? Lesia, do you want to?
Sure. All our neighboring countries are at risk until Russia is neutralized as an aggressor state. Moldova and other countries may have power cuts, all the countries with which we have links, and Ukraine is linked into the European power grid. There's possibility of hits because Russia hits directly on the border, and their missiles are not exactly very direct, as we know by now. So really, these countries, they need to be ready that they will be affected. And actually, if Russia is not pushed back, these countries are likely to be next. Moldova is at a huge risk because we all remember that there's Transnistria there, this part which is essentially occupied by Russia, even back from the 90s. So it's one of the earliest parts where the Russian army has extended its occupying authority. So the only solution to having safety and security for these countries is to push back on Russia militarily and neutralize it as soon as they can. Poland remains the country with the largest number of displaced Ukrainians. There's likely to be more Ukrainians moving to Poland now, because it was one thing to sort of move away for a couple of months and sort of spread out beyond Europe, but when you are a family separated because the husband, for example, is to stay in Ukraine because men who are younger than 60, from 18 to 60, they are not eligible to leave. They cannot leave because they are eligible for military service. The men stay in the country and the women take the children out of the country. It's easier when you are in Poland because the route even to reunite for a short while is much closer than traveling from the UK or from Portugal or from anywhere else in Europe. So many families now relocate to Poland, and also for the winter with the blackouts from Ukraine relocate to Poland or to Hungary or to Moldova, depending where you live in Ukraine, just to be closer to your family, but still keep your children safe, give them a chance at a normal childhood, and give them a chance at an education system. And this just bringing back to Kate's point very briefly on how to help Ukrainians who have been relocated. Well, it's in the interest of Ukraine to have all our people come back, or the majority at least of those who have moved out to come back, especially when it comes to the youth, especially when it comes to children and the youth. We want them back, we want them to remain Ukrainian, we want them to have the strong links with Ukraine. Of course, the longer this war lasts and the longer they stay in foreign countries and foreign education systems, this link gets lost. So what we urge the British government, as well as all the other governments, is to actually allocate resources for Ukrainian cultural centres here, for Ukrainian Sunday schools here in the UK. The resources available to them so far are very limited. And these are the facilities, the institutions, which would definitely be providing this link of maintaining this link with Ukraine to the children. So this is probably a request from us. And another request would also be to have Ukrainian elements integrated into the school curriculums here in the UK. As this war progresses and as the Ukrainians have to stay longer here in the country, we will see hostilities. And there's already alarm bells ringing in some of the schools where Ukrainian children are being sort of bullied in a way by their peers, saying that Ukrainians, you are not welcome here. We have all these prices which are going up because of the war and so on. And this reflects in a way what is being said probably in the households. So the only way to put a stop to these alarm bells which are starting to ring is probably to have school assemblies addressing the issue of what is going on in Ukraine, having you as members of parliament going out and speaking at your local schools and your constituencies, giving talks of why this is an existential war, this is a war between good and evil, this is a war about values, about patriotism. This is something that, actually all of us can learn from each other.
Leslie, I think that Nigel's question was about the countries immediately bordering Ukraine. So would those same lessons apply there?
Absolutely.
I mean, do you have any thoughts on what the situation might be like on the ground in Poland, Moldova, Hungary?
Yeah, we have presence in Poland, Romania, Lithuania as an immediate neighbors. Definitely, in Poland, we supported the establishment of Ukrainian school so the children could come and learn Ukrainian curriculum with Ukrainian teachers, those who do not want to join Polish schools. But generally speaking, a lot of them, as I mentioned before, just don't want to study. So study in the local schools, they want to continue with their Ukrainian curriculum. The number of refugees huge, and Poland doesn't really properly has the estimates of how many and doesn't have gender age desegregated data. That's why it's hard to estimate. However, programming and social protection systems work to accommodate refugees, and definitely all the neighbors of Ukraine really have been supportive of the whole United Europe, I guess, because it's definitely, I can echo what Leslie said, that this is something about democracy, fundamental values of Europeans. So this is, that the support has been huge, but we understand that the capacity and resources are stretched. And although a lot of refugees found jobs and started contributing, paying taxes, so started feeding into the local economy, it's still a challenge, basically, economically for a lot of European countries to hold like millions, especially for such tiny countries that sometimes had the number of refugees half of their population. So that's a real challenge that should be addressed and supported across the board for more inclusive social protection, for case management and registration on borders, so that the whole population of Ukrainian refugees would be accounted, and we would have the clear understanding of who is crossing the border, who is their place of permanent or temporary location, and how to address their social protection needs, because right now it is like a big unknown for many countries, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. David.
Thank you. I mean, we've heard from you already touching on the scale of the human rights and humanitarian laws being violated during the conflict. And I wonder, Leisha, how you feel the international community has reacted to that.
The international community has condemned it on various platforms, but that is nearly hardly enough to have any effect. We are very keen on setting up a special tribunal on Russian aggression against Ukraine, which would actually condemn Russian officials, leadership, for the crime of aggression that is being committed. We urge the UK government to support this initiative from Ukraine and to take up leadership on promoting this initiative between other countries. It is unrealistic for such a specialized tribunal to be set up within the UN system like it normally would have done, because Russia is essentially holding the UN hostage with its veto power over the Security Council. Imagine this: Russia has used the veto power at UN Security Council 134 times. That is more than all of the other nations combined who have the right to this veto power. This brings another question. If the traditional international framework for preventing conflicts, for preventing aggression doesn't work, then possibly we need to reform it and change it. This is another discussion that I urge you to start having and to start thinking. And if not, because this is very complex and complicated, then we at least need to go down the path of isolating Russia from the institutions to which it has zero right to be part of. We are talking about the OSCE, the IPU, we are talking about the UN. And final, there needs to be a suspension of Russia from the Security Council and the suspension of their veto power in the least. But actually, truth be told, Russia has zero right to be a member of the UN, procedurally speaking and legally speaking. This is a very separate discussion, which I also urge you to restart, because this discussion has been going on since the 1990s. But essentially, until Russia learns to behave like a member of the international community that abides by the principle of peaceful coexistence of states, it should be isolated and should not be allowed to be part of that international community.
I mean, obviously, I mean, there's a huge scale of violations. How do you think that the international community, and the UK specifically, obviously today, could do more to help monitor or record these violations, or at least record those which are central to any further action being taken?
Monitoring missions need to be on the ground. We very much welcome when we have international teams of prosecutors who come into the deoccupied areas, like it has been organized when the Kiev region has been deoccupied. We very much welcome the missions which are already working within the ICC, the International Criminal Court proceedings. And we would very much welcome your role in reactivating the UN institutions, and especially the International Red Cross, who should be doing a much better job than they are, because they are essentially, in Ukraine's eyes, they are absent from the scene.
Well, I mean, you've mentioned that a couple of times. So why do you think that is?
Well, because they are not there. They are supposed to be providing aid at times of conflict, at times of wars, and they are simply not there. Because, again, this situation in Ukraine, Russia's aggression, is nothing like has been happening over the last decades. There is an ongoing war in the middle of Europe. There's casualties all the time. There's the party to the war that's the aggressor is actually one of the largest armies in the world, with a lot of political influence, with a lot of money in these very same organizations. So I think there's a lot of political reluctance there, and I think this is something that needs to be taken up, investigated, and the humanitarian international organizations need to be reset as much as the international organizations in principle.
The UK has pledged £220 million in humanitarian support so far for the support in relation to the conflict. I mean, how does that compare to other donors?
I would have to get back to you in writing on that one. I do not have the numbers in front.
And do you think that funding is being distributed quickly enough in terms of how it's, going back to some of the earlier questions, how quickly it's reaching those who are on the front line, so to speak?
As far as I'm aware, that funding goes to the front lines, so it doesn't go to the regions which are not directly on the combat line, on the front line. But again, that means that the people who are considered to be in safe zones, or the regions which are receiving the most number of displaced persons, they do not get that assistance, and they are not in the first line of the recipients of that assistance. But their needs, going back to the very beginning of discussions, they need to be accounted for also, because they are actually receiving the burden of displaced persons. And the cities in West Ukraine, they are not nearly built to accommodate for such a huge influx of people. So they have their own challenges, they have their own issues, and these challenges are not really being discussed and not being addressed, because this is not where the artillery fire is being shot. This is not where there's complete blackouts and complete lack of access to basic resources like water, like I mentioned.
And Amina, do you have any thoughts on the UK support and how it's being distributed?
UK's support was incredible. It was very helpful and effective and prompt, and especially if we're talking about the UK assistance through DEC appeal, the availability of flexible and non-restricted funding, it was exceptionally useful for humanitarian sector to just start its operation and programming immediately without further delay. So that would be probably the lesson learned, that flexible funding and flexible programming that just allows a more prompt action from humanitarian sector. It has been distributed in a large scope, but due to the dynamic of the conflict and to the level of disruption and destruction in Ukraine, and with the growing humanitarian needs, there is an urgent need for more assistance and more sustainable assistance to keep the society and to address the more and more common needs with the situation deteriorating on the ground.
Thank you.
Can I say something? Yes. So. As far as we understand, as a smaller charity operating here, anecdotally, not all aid that is sent gets to the places where it is needed on the ground. And I'm not suggesting that it's done by a big organization who are sending it in bad faith or there is any impropriety, but that's just the fact that needs to be addressed. But that's what we hear, and obviously we don't have the facilities and resources to investigate
How would it be addressed? How would it be addressed then?
Perhaps it would be useful to speak to bigger organizations and analyze how their supply chains are working, how they are collecting information with the exact figures, where the aid is delivered. Is humanitarian aid distributed evenly across the country? Which hospital has received 50 anesthetic machines, whereas those that have none haven't received any. So that kind of information, how closely are these bigger charitable organizations cooperating with the Ukrainian authorities, Ministry of Health, local hospitals, etc. So it just needs to be data-based, this aid, not just appearing figures, 300 tons have been sent to Ukraine. So it has to be directed specifically, and there should be specific direct links with the organizations and people who need the aid.
Thank you. What I'm hearing is you're concerned that the internally displaced people aren't getting the support that they need, and we need to find a way to verify that it is getting to the people that need it the most.
Yes.
Thank you. Richard.
Thank you. Lesya, you mentioned earlier that there needs to be some form of international reckoning for Russia, that for obvious reasons that won't happen in the UN quickly. I take it you were referring earlier to the fact that it was the Soviet Union that joined the UN when it was created, not the Russian Federation. There are various other organizations. You mentioned OSCE. The first time I saw you speak was in Strasbourg. And as you'll know, the Russian Federation is no longer a member of the Council of Europe. Do you see the Council of Europe being a possible route for some form of international tribunal? And if not, what else? What's the most likely route that you think practically stands a reasonable chance of getting enough international support to actually work?
Definitely the Council of Europe has been an example to follow for other international organizations, how you can expel Russia and how you can actually, when that country or any country is not abiding by the rules and procedures, they cannot stay in an organization. What's the point of having them in an organization if they do not follow the rules to which everyone else agrees? That sort of sends the wrong message to all the other members of the organization. And actually this links into the question of appeasement of the aggressor. This route has been tried and tested by Ukraine, unfortunately, back in 2014-2015. This has led to further escalation in 2022. So this message also needs to be very loud and clear that there can be no appeasement. The only way we can ensure a stop of aggression and a non-repetition is by reclaiming all of Ukrainian territories, bringing them back to 1991 internationally recognized borders, and making sure that there's a payback, there's a reparation over by Russia, and that Russia is incapacitated to go on further with any kind of aggression and to start any kind of aggression. Now, international tribunal, the way that this can be done, it should be a coalition of like-minded states. In the same way, there is a coalition around arming Ukraine now in the format of Ramstein, where 53 states, 53 ministers of defense of different states meet on a regular basis. They sit down and they agree the next batch of military assistance for Ukraine and the deliveries. The same way there should be a coalition, an anti-Putin coalition, where like-minded states sit down with their ministries of justice, ministries of foreign affairs, ministries of economy and finance, possibly, to discuss the way that this tribunal is going to operate and the things that Russia will need to pay back for based on this consolidated claim that Ukraine will be ready to present. We are hoping very much that the UK will lead together with Ukraine on this. We will have a team of Ukrainian government officials accompanied by Ukrainian parliamentarians who have been authorized as special envoys by the President of Ukraine to lead on the issue of the setting up of a specialized tribunal on Russia's aggression against Ukraine. I think they will be here in the coming weeks. I urge all of you to meet with them and see where this can be taken.
Can I ask you one more question?
Very small. Can we try and keep it on humanitarian aid?
No, it's not.
No, it was a larger diplomatic question. I'll leave it for now.
Which I have.
No, well,
Thank you so much for all the evidence given today. I know this is deeply personal and harrowing and incredibly brave of you to share. I guess what we all want to know here is what more can the UK do, particularly in diplomatic international circles. We talked about the IPU, and of course we were, Kate and I were with you at the IPU just very recently. What more do we need to do collectively here in the UK, diplomatically, internationally, multilaterally, in order to move this, on a humanitarian basis at least, move things forward much more progressively? I'll start with yourself now. I'm going to come to yourself.
Yeah. Yes, there are several asks. First are related to justice and accountability. We understand that we are keeping an eye on violations, recording them, collaborating with accountability actors, and we see strong role of the UK as a strong ally of Ukraine and advocate globally for justice, to collaborate and establish dialogue between all justice sector mechanisms now set up in Ukraine, and to create this dialogue so that not everyone would be doing something individually, but there would be collaboration, and the victims would not be re-traumatized, being sort of in different investigations by different accountability actors. That's why, as well, from Save the Children perspective, of course, we're asking for child rights expertise and children to be in focus of attention for justice mechanisms, because sometimes children are deprioritized or thought to be small and not understand everything or forget, and this is not just true, because children grow up, become adults, and this lost in impact. Of course, all victims of this situation in Ukraine deserve justice, and this is a strong role of UK to play and to secure this justice for children. Second is access. I'm repeating myself, but access is crucial to non-government controlled areas and to near the contact line. So just engaged in negotiations, exempt the humanitarian actors from sanctions, and ensure safe passage. Engage again UN agencies for other NGO sector humanitarian assistance actors to join them and get some assurances and guarantees of safety passage to deliver the aid, and protect children on the move, because we understand the refugee population is huge, and such children with particularly vulnerable backgrounds as orphans, or as separated and unaccompanied children are at risk. So case management, increased funding, and child protection programming to support those on the move and those who access new territories, so that renovations of schools and repairs on the ground, and especially landmine programming, inclusive child protection programming and additional funding would enable humanitarian actors to assist communities to recover and come back to a safe life in their communities.
I don't mind giving the word to Natalia though.
Okay, so in terms of the priorities and what kind of help we would like to see, that's I've already said it, I'll repeat it again, the support of local Ukrainian volunteering movement and charitable non-profit organization, help them with operational costs, as simple support as that would have a huge impact. Provide help Ukraine to get generators and power station supplies, and something that hasn't been talked about today is the training. So the training of paramedics and firemen brigades. As far as we know, the firemen who are involved on a daily basis in rescue operations across every region in Ukraine, they apparently only have 1 hour of medical training each year, and it's only theoretical, and they have no realistic scenario training. And so it's essential we actually have a project now when 2 of our volunteers are now working in the Mykolaiv region, and we supplied them with tactical medical equipment, and they're training the firemen. First of all, they can look after themselves, and also they can act as first responders. So that is critical, and if any help could be provided with that, that would be very much appreciated.
I will continue this list, actually. So the demining equipment, the robotics for demining, this is very crucial. That will save lives, both children's lives and the specialists who are working on the demining operations. As for the training of specialists, I have to reinforce the point on psychologists and psychosocial assistants. This is a must, especially in the occupied territories. We need more women specialists who can talk to the women who have been or may have been sexually abused in those territories. It is crucial to reinforce organizations that help survivors. Veterans is a big one. We haven't touched on those, but military men and women are coming back. Some with a lot most with traumas which they will need to be dealing with and which their families need to be dealing with. This is something to prepare for, especially in the future. Treatment for Ukrainian wounded soldiers. The physical wound may be the same, we are all human, but the psychology behind it is very different. The UK has excellent facilities and excellent experience with all your organizations who I have had the pleasure to know personally. Please reactivate them into being there on the ground in Ukraine. Something that we need is building and construction material. And here it's about not so much providing us with ready-made products manufactured here in the UK, although of course this will help the UK's economy. We have industries standing at a standstill because of the war, because there's no orders coming in, there's no demand. But provide us with the textiles and we will sew the uniform for our military, for our paramedics, for our emergency services ourselves, giving jobs to the people there on the ground and allowing the economy not to collapse. This is crucial for us. The same goes with any kind of other, give us the raw materials which we cannot produce right now in Ukraine and we will restart whole industries. This is important for us. And investment, bring in investments, don't be scared. Now is the opportunity to invest in Ukraine. You will have a huge summit on the reconstruction of Ukraine in July here. I would urge to have a parliamentary section there, and I would urge to have a section on small and medium business, where we can discuss all these needs and possible potential investment into Ukraine. Now, the best humanitarian assistance that we can get is money and weapons, and you cannot shy away from that. Weapons, because as soon as we finish this war, as soon as there is victory for Ukraine, it will also bring a victory for all the other countries, Russia included, the Russian people included. So this is in our utmost and highest interests. And how do we do that? By strengthening Ukraine and weakening Russia. We weaken Russia with sanctions. We weaken Russia with taking away their money, which can be used or relied on to manufacture more weapons, to order in more components, to produce the missiles that kill Ukrainians, Ukrainian children, and this 2-day-old baby Serhiy, which Narmina has mentioned previously. I think we all have a duty to democracy, a duty to human lives, and a duty to prevent genocide. And Russia is doing exactly that against Ukraine, committing a genocide. All the characteristics are there. The deportations, the direct targeting of civilians, of hospitals, of schools, of kindergartens. We cannot shy away from that as well. We have a duty to prevent according to the convention, and it is high time that we act on this duty.
Thank you. I want to start by saying, from parliamentarian to parliamentarian and your colleagues here at the moment, that the depth of duty that you have shown to your country is extraordinary, and I speak on not just behalf of this committee but on behalf of this House to say that we have so much solidarity with you, and you've given us lots of information, and we will take that back to fellow parliamentarians, and you've given us very clear asks that we will make very clearly to those that have the authority to do it. To Natalia, to set up what you've set up and to keep on going is remarkable, and I give you huge credit. And to Narmina, to go through what you've gone through and to be there to try and help other people is fantastic. I don't know from other committee members, but I think we're seeing so much about what's going on in Ukraine that there is a bit of a malaise towards it now, and what you've done in this session is you have made it incredibly real for all of us. You have given us the evidence, but more importantly you've given us the emotions and what's literally happening on the ground, that we can go and argue for continued support for your country, because as I get older I understand evil less and less, and I cannot understand the mindset of what's going on with the Russian state right now, and we absolutely have to stand strong against it, because it doesn't end, it just keeps on expanding, as we've seen globally over the last few decades. Thank you all very much. Thank you, committee members. And order. This session is now closed. Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.